Hi, everyone. I'm for the Black History Month event. We have Dr. Marisa Litz from the Washington State Department of Fish and Wildlife here to speak with us about salmon, different species of salmon that are most common in Washington State, and some struggles that the salmon are having during reproduction, and just things that they're having issues with their reproduction and just trying to propagate. Why are they struggling to survive? So I'll go ahead and turn it over to Dr. Litz, and she can tell us more about it.
All right, thank you, Nicole. It's my pleasure to be here with the Puget Sound Estuarium celebrating Black History Month. So my name is Marisa Litz, and I am a research scientist with the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife. So my unit, we're responsible for monitoring juvenile and adult salmon in Western Washington and the Lower Columbia River. So today I have a talk. I'm going to go over the biology, the ocean ecology, and a kind of high-level look at the management of Pacific salmon in the Puget Sound area and the Pacific Northwest in general. So my background, so my mom was an immigrant. She came from Trinidad and Tobago, and she met my dad, and I was raised in Maine before moving to the Pacific Northwest. But my parents really instilled this love of nature and a passion for the outdoors, including the ocean and for fisheries. And so I was really lucky in that in my graduate work, I was supported by a program from NOAA Fisheries. So it was the NOAA Educational Partnership Program with minority serving institutions. And really the goal of NOAA is to create a more diverse workforce. So to support students in natural resources and climate science and atmospheric science, and really provide this work-ready pipeline of diverse young folks that are ready to hit the ground running. So I'm a proud sort of, alumni of that program. And I've been in Washington now for 4 years. I was in Oregon and British Columbia before that. So I've been in the Pacific Northwest a long time, but really excited to share you my presentation. And if you could hold all questions to the end, I'll try my best to get to all of them live. And if not, I'll also answer them in the comments box. So I go ahead and get my screen all set up for you.
Excellent.
And Nicole, if you can just let me know if you see my slides.
I will do that. Let's see, I just see you, Dr. Litz.
Try again here. All right.
Yep, I see your screen. The biology, ocean ecology, and management of Pacific salmon.
All right, so everyone, again, I'm thrilled to be here, and I hope that you all learned something about the biology of Pacific salmon. So for my talk this evening, I am going to, it's 3 parts. So I'm going to start with an introduction of Pacific salmon and go over the species that co-occur here in the Pacific Northwest, talk about some of their unifying characteristics and some of the species differences. Next, I'm going to transition and talk a little bit about the tools that we use for research and management. And then I'm going to end the talk with going over sort of the crises and the issues that Pacific salmon face. So these are typically characterized by the 4 H's, so hatcheries, harvest, hydropower, and habitat. But I also want to get into some information about conservation and the Endangered Species Act, and also some recent problems that salmon are facing related to climate change and ocean conditions. So in the Pacific Northwest, it's no surprise that salmon are an iconic species. So they're socially, culturally, economically, and ecologically important in the Pacific Northwest. And the treaty tribes have been harvesting them sustainably for millennia as have species like the killer whale that rely almost exclusively on salmon in their diet. And they're also important historically in the industrialization along the US West Coast, so the canneries that emerged along the Columbia River. And we never would have thought 100 years ago that we would be in crisis when we came to talking about salmon. Now, salmon have some unifying characteristics. So on the right of this figure here, I'm showing the salmon life cycle and some terminology that we can all become familiar with. So salmon, adult salmon that are reproducing are also known as spawners. And the salmon that make it to their spawning grounds are known as escapement. So those, the total escapement are those total numbers. The nests that salmon build are known as redds, their eggs as roe, and then the juveniles that emerge from the gravel go through several stages of alvin, fry, and the juveniles are also known as par, and they can be distinguished by those distinct bands or par marks on their sides. Now, juveniles, when they're ready to go to the ocean, they go through this complex physiological transition called smoltification. So those juveniles that are ocean ready are known as smolts. And then they go to the ocean so that they can grow large and then return. So some of these unifying characteristics, so salmon are also known as anadromous species. So that means that they live in both the freshwater and the marine environment. They have this ability to home, and that's to return from the ocean to their natal streams to reproduce. And we think that they're cueing into these environmental signals. Salmon are also semiparous, and what that means is that they die after reproducing, similar to an octopus. And the exception here is the steelhead trout, so they're itoparous. And also, all salmon provide this ecosystem service where they deliver marine-derived nutrients to terrestrial ecosystems. Now, the 5 main species that we find in the Pacific Northwest are, from top to bottom, the Chinook or the king salmon, the coho or the silver salmon, the chum or the dog salmon, the pink or the humpy, and the sockeye, also known as the red salmon. And they look differently depending on whether they're just in the ocean or whether they're returning to reproduce in there, and they have their spawning colors. And the 5 main species, and they also include steelhead. And steelhead are the anadromous form of the rainbow trout. Now they vary, they have these similar characteristics, but they also vary by their distribution, their run timing, their size at maturity, their age at maturity, and also the relative economic value. So the distribution of Pacific and salmon and steelhead across the North Pacific. So in green of this map here, we have the terrestrial systems where they spawn, they reproduce, and the juveniles rear. And then when they hit the ocean is in these blue areas of the entire North Pacific, including parts of the Arctic. And here I am sitting in Olympia talking to you on Facebook Live. But the ocean distribution of salmon really remains this black box. We know that salmon go out, and relatively speaking, we know that they have this broad distribution through the Gulf of Alaska, but we really don't know population by population and through the winter where they're located. So, but we do know some of their range distributions. So in freshwater, for example, the southern extent of the range of the species are as follows. So pink salmon are only located as far south as Puget Sound, but they sometimes can be encountered in fisheries in Oregon and California. Chum salmon spawn mostly, or the furthest south they're located is Central Oregon. Sockeye in the Idaho in Redfish Lake. Chinook and coho salmon, the Big Sur River, and steelhead can be found all the way into Baja, Mexico. Now, like they are vary in their sort of southern extent, they also differ in their spawning distribution. So pink and chum salmon, their juveniles spend the least amount of time rearing in fresh water, and they arrive ready to spawn. And pink salmon may even spawn in the lower estuary and the lower parts of the river. As you get into fall and fall Chinook and coho salmon, they move further into the river systems, but not nearly as much as what you may see with sockeye salmon that spawn and rear in high alpine lakes, steelhead have this incredible leaping ability, and they can make it all the way up into the upper watershed. And then spring chinook, or the spring kingers, or the spring hogs. So these fish are incredible because they have the capacity, they enter, their spawning migration into freshwater begins in the spring, and they can travel hundreds and hundreds of miles upstream to their natal streams to spawn. And typically during that period, they're not feeding, and they come in with these large stores of lipid or fat. So some of the large North American populations that we have, so sockeye in Bristol Bay in Alaska, so 50, 60 million fish is not unheard of there. Prince William Sound in Alaska produces a lot of pinks. Other parts of Southeast Alaska produce lots of chum salmon. In Canada, the Fraser River, stronghold for sockeye as well as pink salmon. Puget Sound, we're known for our coho, but we have, all species co-occurring here. And then large runs also come into the Columbia River and the Sacramento. Now, some of these differences are really kind of unique to the life history. So one of these is age at maturity. So on the left, we have the pink salmon or the humpy, and on the right, we have the Chinook salmon. And pink salmon really have this fixed age at maturity. They are 2-year life cycles. So every 2 years, and in Washington, we have pink salmon that run in odd years. So we'll be getting them in 2021. And it's so unique that we can, in Alaska, for example, they'll have the same watershed, will have even and odd year pink salmon, but they're totally reproductively isolated and genetically distinct. Chinook salmon, on the other hand, so especially the males, they can become sexually mature at a much younger age. And we refer to those as jacks. So you can have jacks that have only spent a few months in the ocean become sexually mature and return to the spawning grounds. Those are mini jacks, or a year later as these jacks at age 2, but more typically at age 3 or age 4. And the Chinook, or the king salmon, they also have this other suite of life history diversity that can be expressed. So, for example, I was showing you earlier the pictures of the spring Chinook that make the large 100-mile migrations versus the small fall Chinook. Both of them spawn in the fall, but the difference is that the spring run into the freshwater in the springtime and the fall in the fall. And so those springers, they usually return to the river in an immature state, whereas the fall will be in a more mature state. And they have different distributions. So the upper river versus more the main stem of the river system. The juveniles also have different traits. So the spring Chinook, they'll rear for a year in freshwater, whereas fall Chinook typically only spend 3 to 6 months before heading to the ocean. And then their ocean distribution can be very different. So generally speaking, the spring Chinook have a more oceanic distribution, whereas the fall Chinook are more coastally distributed. Now, they also differ among species in their economic value. So this figure here just shows the price per pound, so 1984 through 2019 of the 5 different main species of Pacific salmon. And the green line you can see is that Chinook, or the king salmon. So really the most valuable of all of the Pacific salmon. So it's not uncommon for them to be $5, $6, $7 per pound at the vessel price. So you could go to the market and you could pay $20, $30, $40 a pound for spring Chinook salmon. It is really that valuable. In 2019, in Alaska alone, the salmon produced $700 million to the economy. So it's a pretty big industry. So after Chinook salmon, so sockeye and coho are the next most valuable species. And then the chum and the pink, which are less valued as food fish, but really valuable as canned fish, have the lowest value. Now, salmon management is a complex and a multi-jurisdictional process. So just moving from sort of left to right, or sort of broader scale to more finer scale. So in the US, so from Alaska down to California, and including bilateral agreements that the US is engaged in with the government of Canada, salmon are managed under the auspices of the Pacific Salmon Treaty. So the Pacific Salmon Commission was established in Vancouver to ensure that the rights of fishers in Canada and US share that resource. So oftentimes salmon can originate in the US, but they're intercepted by fisheries in Canada and vice versa. So this agreement that was ratified in 1985 ensures that there's shared harvesting of those resources. And many people from Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife serve on the panels and the technical committees of the Pacific Salmon Commission. Now, in the economic exclusive zone of the US, so this is from 3 to 200 miles offshore in Oregon, Washington, and California, Pacific salmon are managed by the Pacific Fishery Management Council, and they really oversee a lot of our coastal fisheries. And then more locally, we are bound by our obligations of co-management that the state of Washington shares the harvest of salmon with the treaty tribes in an agreement known as the North of Falcon process. So this is overseen by, the legal requirements dictated by the US v. Washington and US v. Oregon court cases. And the Falcon refers to that Cape Falcon in Northern Oregon. So everything north of Cape Falcon to the Canadian border. So part of managing salmon is to understanding sort of the different population dynamics of hatchery versus wild fish and really targeting hatchery fish. So in the mid-90s, when we realized that there was some of the wild fish were in trouble, there was agreement, the stipulation on mass marking. So all hatchery fish in Washington, literally all, are marked. And their adipose fin, which is a fin on their dorsal side near their caudal tail, is removed. So Washington has one of the most extensive hatchery programs in the world, over 100 hatcheries managed by the tribes, the state, and the federal government. And all of those fish get marked. We also have programs to tag the fish to manage them. And two of the most popular tags that are used for this work are the coded wire tag and the passive integrated transponder, or PIT tags. So the coded wire tags, so these are fairly inexpensive and they're widely used in management. They're fairly cheap and they're small, like the size of a staple, but they're embossed with a single code per each release group of fish. So annually, we deploy about 50 million of these, and about 250,000 are recovered. Pit tags are a little bit different. They're each tag on a pit tag is unique. They're a little bit more expensive, but freshwater systems like the Columbia River can be wired to detect these pit tags as fish transit through these hydro systems. So an example of that, so I was involved in a study about 10 years ago with a scientist from NOAA Fisheries, Lori Whitecamp. And this is just following one fish that had a pit tag in it. So this fish was tagged in January at the Lions Ferry Hatchery, which is operated by the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife. It was about 150 millimeters at the time it was tagged. And a few months later, it was released at Captain John Rapids. And over the course of about a month, it was detected 4 times at the Little Goose Dam, at the Lower Monumental Dam, at the John Day Dam. And then Lori and I picked this fish up when we were purse seining in the Lower Columbia River Estuary in about a month later. So at this point, the fish was 172 millimeters. And what we can glean from the tag is a lot of information about this one fish. So we know that it had a growth rate of about 0.23 millimeters a day. And we also know as it moved through the Columbia River system that it migrated at a rate of about 8 to 56 kilometers a day, speeding up as it got closer to the ocean. Now, a natural tag that salmon also have is related to its distinct genetics. So homing is that quality that makes salmon return to their natal streams and be reproductively or relatively reproductively isolated. And because of this, we can use their genetics as a tool to examine individual stock or determine stock status, look at parentage, look at differential run timing, as well as a number of other factors. And this figure here just shows a real difference in the genetics. So Puget Sound coho have pretty low diversity. They're all that green color, whereas coastal Washington coho are locally adapted to their individual watersheds. And there's a large diversity in the different colors shown there. So this next part of the talk, I'm going to transition into the issues that Pacific salmon face. So again, the 4 H's, so the hatcheries, the harvest, the hydropower, and the habitat, as well as conservation issues. And more recently that we're thinking about is the climate change and the ocean conditions. So to start with, I'm going to talk about the hatcheries. So the goal of the hatcheries is to reduce the early natural mortality. And a little terminology here. So a wild fish is a fish, the adults move into the freshwater natural systems, they spawn, the eggs are incubated in the gravel and emerge, the juveniles rear and they head out to the ocean, they grow large over 1 to several years, and then they return to spawn. So no sort of interception of those fish. Hatchery salmon, on the other hand, are where the broodstock from the adults are spawned, and then their fry are reared in a hatchery until the juveniles are ready for release and heading into the ocean. And then both of these are different from farm salmon that you may have heard of. So Atlantic salmon that you can buy at the grocery store, where they spend their entire life in captivity, being reared in net pens. So hatcheries, so in a natural system, the mortality from the adult to the juvenile stage may be anywhere from 50 to 95%. But in a hatchery, you can reduce that mortality to less than 10%. And that's one of the real advantages of hatcheries. But what we've discovered is that while there's multiple benefits of hatchery rearing fish in terms of social and economic and fishing opportunity, we also know that hatchery fish may have a lower fitness compared to wild fish, and there may be some certain risks. So those may be related to the genetics. So when you are spawning fish in a hatchery, you may see a reduction in their genetic diversity. That can lead to maladaptation or domestication of certain traits about run timing, size, life history expression, those types of things. Ecologically, when you have these large release groups of hatchery fish, you can lead to predator swamping. So you may have marine birds, or you may have predators that all queue in to all those hatchery fish being released at the same time. And then you can have these detrimental effects of predators all queuing into this one release group. Hatchery fish may compete with wild fish, especially when they're really abundant. And then another issue is that large releases of hatchery fish can lead to outbreaks of disease or pathogens. And this is especially true in systems like the Columbia River, where large hatchery groups get barged downstream through reservoir to reservoir down dam systems. And then also there's fishing pressure. So we really want to target hatchery fish, those ones that have the marks on them. But we'll also intercept wild fish. And while we can release them, there's going to be some portion of those that are going to be vulnerable to mortality as well. And hatchery production is big business. So this is a figure here showing the hatchery production in 2019 across the North Pacific. So 5.5 billion juvenile salmon were released into the North Pacific in 2019. And that's been pretty stable over the last several decades. The big producers of hatchery fish we do in Alaska, so especially chum and pink salmon, but also the countries, Russia produces a lot of hatchery fish, as does Japan. And what's a small fact that most people don't recognize is that there's actually more salmon in the North Pacific now than any time in the last century. And that's on account of the release of all those juvenile hatchery fish. And on our area, we rely more on hatchery production of Chinook and coho and sockeye. So the second issue that Pacific salmon face, so the second H, is harvest. So, and this is actually a really interesting time to have this talk because it's sort of the beginning of the salmon setting process that occurs in Washington every year. So we're February 25th, but tomorrow, for those that are interested in learning about the salmon harvesting management, I encourage you to log into the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife North of Falcon preseason kickoff meeting when we're going to be revealing all the forecasts for salmon for 2021 as we begin crafting salmon management plans for the season. So it all starts now. And then over the next several months, the treaty tribes and the state will be meeting in a series of negotiations to make sure that we craft fisheries that are compliant with conservation, the legal framework, and we really are reliant on public input and input from other stakeholders to make these fishery plans. They're released in about April, and then our fisheries are prosecuted throughout the summer. As fish begin moving into their freshwater systems, armies of biologists are there to count them, monitoring them, and all of this data feeds into our data sets that we use for stock assessment and management. And that's what we do over the winter is we generate forecasts for the next year, and the process begins again. But again, I remind people, join us tomorrow to begin learning about the process and be involved. So harvest is a big part of being a member of, an outdoor member of the Pacific Northwest. And this picture here just shows the Columbia River Buoy 10 recreational salmon fishery. Usually begins in the summertime, and it's it can be a lot of fun. But in terms of the challenges that Pacific salmon face, they can be related to management. So it's really complex. So some of the issues are that we prosecute mixed stock fisheries. So there are multiple different stocks that are all milling in the ocean and in the Columbia River. And we have to make sure that we're harvesting fish that are abundant and leaving the fish that are vulnerable. We also have to allocate the catch to the different stakeholders, so the commercial fishermen, the tribes, the sportsmen, and we have to make sure it's equitable. We have to harvest at sustainable rates to make sure that we conserve the resource into the future. And then we're limited by the amount of fish that we can take from listed species. Economically, there's also the hardship of declining prices for wild fish, and this may be related to competition from farm fish or from other systems where there's a lot of fish. So one example here is, that Bristol Bay sockeye fishery that I mentioned. So in 2020, over just 3 weeks in June and July, 36 million fish were harvested. So, if you can fathom that amount of fish being harvested in such a short amount of time, it's a pretty colossal effort. So the third issue, the third H that salmon face is hydropower. And the main issue with hydropower is that dams block access to habitat for rearing and spawning salmon. So example here, the Grand Coulee Dam, and millions of dollars have been spent since 1978 improving fish passage systems to minimize mortality and migration delays. So a lot of these are engineering challenges. And this fish ladder shown here just shows ways in which migrating salmon can move around a dam by swimming up these fish ladders. So one of the more famous dams or historical dam in Washington State is the Elwha Dam. So it was over 100 years old. Its function was no longer relevant. And in 1992, talk about decommissioning and removing this dam began. And it didn't actually happen until 2011, but over the course of several months, this 108-foot structure was removed. So almost immediately, fish regained access to about 70 river miles of spawning habitat. And what scientists found was really interesting was that salmon returned upstream to spawn within months of the dam being removed. All of the silt that was impounded behind that dam was released, and sedimentation expanded the river mouth delta by over 400 meters. But for biologists and hydrologists, it really afforded us this unique opportunity to evaluate the physical and ecological response to dam removal. And many of my colleagues at DFW have been part of that important work. So the fourth issue faced by Pacific salmon is habitat. So dams provide are one source of barriers to habitat. But another one is culverts. And the state of Washington has over 1,000 culverts that serve as fish passage barriers. We're slowly beginning to remove those or correct them so that fish have access to more rearing and spawning habitat. And along the way, we're also engaged actively across many of the watersheds in the state on process-based restoration. So these are efforts that happen in freshwater, things like engineered log jams that are with the goal of increasing the connectivity between the river and the floodplains, lowering temperatures by planting, increasing more natural flow regimes, increasing the amount of sedimentation and spawning gravel for salmon to spawn in, increasing floodwater or groundwater inputs and what's known as poor hyperrheic flow. So a lot of this activity is really important to the restoration of freshwater habitat, especially with increased development and urbanization across the state. So those are the 4 H's, and now I want to get into some of the other issues that face Pacific salmon in our state. And one of those is conservation, or the Endangered Species Act. So a couple terms here. So endangered refers to a population that's at risk of extinction throughout all or a significant portion of its range. And threatened is a population that's likely to become endangered in the foreseeable future. And currently along the West Coast, there are 28 species listed under the Federal Endangered Species Act. And those include all of the species of Pacific salmon and steelhead except pink salmon. And the map on the right shows the 8 recovery domains where we do a lot of intensive research and monitoring. Recovery is said to occur when a salmon or a steelhead population is naturally self-sustaining with a low risk of extinction over 100 years based on certain key attributes. And those attributes are, what are its relative abundance year to year? How about the productivity? So how many viable offspring does a spawning pair produce? The diversity, maintaining that diversity, so that genetic diversity, that physiological diversity, how they look, their morphological diversity and their behavioral diversity, also maintaining sort of the spatial diversity where those fish are distributed. So conservation is big, it's a big factor in managing Pacific salmon. So the last thing that I want to talk to you about is climate change and environmental variability and changing ocean conditions and how that's affecting Pacific salmon. So this figure here just shows in 2015, we experienced really extreme drought and really high temperatures. So even though these salmon, they were reared, they went out to the ocean, they grew large, when they were returning to reproduce, they encountered really high temperatures. And it's estimated in the Columbia River, like half of the sockeye population perished before they ever reached the spawning grounds. And it's likely that events like that are only going to become more frequent in the future. So a colleague of mine, James Losley, recently evaluated the Pacific salmon and steelhead populations of Puget Sound from 1970 to 2015. And what James found, so the natural populations in red and the hatchery populations in black, is pretty much across the board, we're seeing declines in species abundance. And this analysis ended in 2015, but really we've started to see kind of a more rapid acceleration of this decline since 2015 related to environmental conditions. And this is a combination of both terrestrial factors as well as marine factors. So Last year, we had one of the most devastating wildfire seasons, and that's a hallmark of climate change. It's likely to keep impacting us during the summer months. And these are destroying some of the watersheds where juvenile salmon are rearing or returning. And then this figure here shows a figure. These images are from September of 2020. So on the left is the temperature, and on the right is the precipitation. Red indicates we are either above average in terms of temperature or below average in terms of precipitation. So when we have conditions like this, when we have high temperatures and we have low precipitation, especially in the wintertime, what that leads to is very low snowpack, and then subsequently high temperatures and low stream flow in the summer. And this is going to have impacts on juvenile salmon that are rearing in freshwater systems. And I know looking outside, people are like, well, it is one of the coldest winters we've experienced in a long time. And that's true. But this, and I'll explain a little bit more about that in a bit. But these conditions in freshwater can lead to subsequent or carryover effects into the marine environment. So this is just what researchers saw in 2015. So once the salmon had out-migrated from the freshwater systems in 2015, oceanographers were catching these salmon. What we were seeing was really emaciated and skinny salmon. And just a really interesting fact here is that most salmon that make it out to the ocean don't survive. That's just typical. So typically less than 5% of the salmon that make it to the ocean survive. So 95% perish. And most of those perish during their first few months in the ocean. It's known as this critical life history phase. And it can be variable year to year, but it has a really dramatic impact. So the difference between 2% marine survival and 4% marine survival is the difference in, twofold abundance returning as adults. And the reason for the fish dying, it varies, but it's typically related to the ocean conditions and the prey quality or the prey quantity, the number of predators that are picking off the salmon, as well as the number of competitors that are competing for resources. And when the salmon are in the ocean, they're also impacted by very large-scale global processes. So an example of these are the El Nino, and then the cool water phase of El Nino, which is known as La Nina. And that's what we're currently experiencing right now. So both of these phenomena, they start off in the equator, either with a slackening or an intensification of winds. And what you get is either during an El Nino, really warm surface water at the equator, or a La Nina, very cool surface water temperature at the equator. And how these manifest is that they change global weather patterns. And what we've seen since 2015 is really an increasing frequency of El Nino and La Nina events. And like I said, we're currently in a La Nina. And why that may be some good news for salmon is that during an El Nino, we typically have bad conditions. It's warm, the ocean is hot, it's warmer in the Pacific Northwest, and that doesn't favor salmon survival. Whereas during a La Nina, that tropical polar jet will move more northerly, and we'll get more of these polar vortex type events. So cool, wet air in the Pacific Northwest. And that's exactly what we're experiencing now. And it's exactly what they're seeing in Texas. Anyone from Texas who might be in the audience, of these plunging of this Arctic air south. So these are typically good for Pacific Northwest. But our current La Nina is actually supposed to phase out. That's the climate projection by April through June, so spring of this year. But then there's also more local factors that are affecting the ocean in the Pacific Northwest. So one of these is this phenomenon known as the warm blob. So oceanographers first identified the warm blob in 2014. And what it was this pool of warm sea surface temperature in the Gulf of Alaska. It formed in 2014, and it just began to expand and expand. And by July of 2015, an El Nino began forming at the equator, and the warm blob in the north and the El Nino at the equator joined forces. So October of 2015 this is when we saw that dramatic drought in the Pacific Northwest, a lot of that pre-spawn mortality, really devastating and dramatic downturns in salmon survival. Now, since then, we've had the blob activity has waned on and off. In 2020, we have a new tool to track blobs, and we had 2 separate blob events. And the September 2020 blob that we had was actually the second largest in size, in area, and longest that we'd had since 2014. It's estimated that it affected over 9 million square kilometers of the North Pacific. So this is going to be a more frequent and regular occurrence. And some of the biological responses to the warm ocean can be seen here. Now, one of the most dramatic things that we've seen is the incidence of subtropical and tropical species, fish species, showing up off of Washington. So in 2018, we had a record-breaking opa, we had bluefin tuna, mahi-mahi caught off Longview and Nawaco. And this continued into 2020, where we had barracuda in the Pacific Northwest. This is in British Columbia, as well as yellowtail. With the warm ocean, the cool and productive part of the ecosystem gets really impinged along the coast. And so what we've been seeing here is that things will mash up against the coast, and we're seeing more and more whales becoming entangled in fishing gear. We also know the plight of the southern resident killer whale. We've all been watching that with anticipation. As I mentioned, salmon is one of their obligate prey. But this has also affected species in Alaska, like the Pacific cod. But it's not all bad news. In 2020, during the COVID pandemic, we saw in Puget Sound one of the largest herring spawn activities ever in decades. And this is really good news because herring are a preferred prey of salmon. And then off the coast and also in Puget Sound, there's also been large squid fisheries. And this is kind of a mixed signal because squid can be competitors with juvenile salmon. But oceanographers and biologists are also concerned that the warm blob can become kind of a crock pot, a perfect storm for brewing harmful algal blooms. And anyone paying attention to sort of crab or clam fisheries will note that those levels of domoic acid that are caused by Pseudonychia, a toxic harmful algae, a diatom, are really impacting some of those fisheries as well. And in 2020, so some unusual salmon observations that we saw. So that Bristol Bay, we have winners and we have losers. So Bristol Bay continued to have these huge run, 48, almost 50 million salmon. But at the same time, salmon sort of at the southern extent of their range, returning to the Fraser River in Canada or Baker Lake, Lake Washington, saw some of the historic low levels. We also saw really poor returns of steelhead to Puget Sound, poor chum returns to Puget Sound into the Fraser River in Canada. But interestingly, some other things. So at Bonneville Dam in the Columbia River, there's fish counters. And over 90% of the fish that were counted at Bonneville in recent years have been an invasive species, American shad. And so it's estimated 6-7 million shad are returning to the Columbia River. We really don't know their ecological impact on some of the fish. But 2020 also saw some of the highest coho jack returns to the Columbia River since 1980. And why this is of note is that the jacks can sometimes be a foreshadowing of the adults that we'll see in 2021. So we could have really high numbers of coho coming back next year. So one of the tools that we use to sort of monitor this is the salmon stoplight chart or indicator chart. So this is a tool based on monitoring and created by NOAA Fisheries. And it's color-coded, so bad and red and green and good, or green for good. And it's organized so across the top, each row or each column is a particular year. And that year corresponds to those juvenile salmon, the ocean conditions that those juvenile salmon are going to hit when they outmigrate into the ocean and when, there's that high mortality. And then they're broken down into sort of basin scale indicators. So things like the El Nino or sea surface temperature, the blob in the North Pacific, or more regional indicators. So more local temperature and salinity, as well as a number of regional indicators. So what's the prey like? So what's the composition of the food web at the base of the food web there? And then each is color coded and then ranked. So as you can see, so the red, so 2015 onwards to about 2017, we had these really bad ocean conditions for salmon, poor survival. But we've started to transition out of that 2018 and 2019. And in 2020, we have a mixed bag. We're starting to see a lot more of those green indicators. But what's interesting is that some of those indicators that are good are the ones related to the biology. So the zooplankton, the larval fish like the herring, and some of the others like related to marine heat waves, temperature are still pretty poor. So how do we put these all together to manage fish? Well, here's just a quick example for you all. So on the left, we have 3 different time series. So the first one is sea surface temperature on the top. And you can see above average in red is warm, below average in blue is cool. And then 2 different community composition of the zooplankton, or the sort of prey field at the base of the food web. So the first in the middle is the northern copepods. So these are critters that are entrained and transported down from Alaska. They're large copepods. They're really fatty. We call them the cheeseburgers of the sea. And the one on the bottom are these lipid poor copepods. So these come more from California and from the south. They're small. They're not very nutritious. They don't have a lot of fat stores. And we can use sort of the relative abundance of these to make predictions about salmon. So as you can see in the box, there's that beginning in 2015, we saw like none of the good copepods and a ton of the bad copepods. And then in the last year, we've been sort of transitioning and we're seeing more of the lipid-rich copepods and less hot temperatures. So we combine this information. So this is an example of a forecast for coho in the Strait of Juan de Fuca, so near where the Elwha Dam is located. And our monitoring crews estimated that there are about 300,000 juvenile coho that hit the ocean in 2020. And so they experienced this sort of these ocean conditions that we expect that there's going to be about a 3% marine survival of those schools. And so we can estimate from our models predictions that there's going to be about 8,000 that return. And so this, if you want to learn more about this, again, tune in tomorrow to the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife North of Falcon preseason kickoff meeting. We'd love to have you and to have public input and to be engaged in the process. But with that, that's all I have for you tonight. So lots of information you can find. Here's some great books as references, some websites related to Endangered Species Act listings, some salmon management, and of course, the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife. Also, check out Ray Troll's artwork. He has some great salmon artwork out there. So with that, that's all I have. So I'd be happy to answer any questions. So, and I will.
Thank you so much, Dr. Litz. Let's see if we have any questions in the chat. And yes, we do. We have an excellent question from Jeff Mantefel, and he asks, "What are the salmon ladders working in terms of maintaining regional populations, or are the hatcheries bearing the burden of population stipends?"
So, Jeff, that's a great question. And, there's been this enormous investment in salmon ladders, as well as sort of the marking and monitoring of fish passage. And they're doing, by and large, what they were intended to do. And it's not just salmon, but there's other federally listed species or species that are of, high cultural significance to some of the tribes, things like lamprey. That are also, we're learning more about how to make the dams more passable for them. So hatcheries are not necessarily taking the burden of poor survival through the hydro system. Even systems like the Snake River, new research is saying that that survival from the Snake to the ocean does not significantly impacted by that fish passage.
Okay, thank you, Doctor. We have another question from Orlay. If chum returned poor in Puget Sound and Fraser, was it also low in Columbia River, formerly endangered populations?
So chum salmon are currently listed in the Columbia River. So there's a huge undertaking to sort of prop up those populations of chum. And there's also the summer chum population in Hood Canal is also a listed population. But what is interesting about chum salmon is that we thought that they were pretty resilient to the effects of climate change. So especially when we started seeing a lot of the downturns in the steelhead and the chinook and the coho kind of post 2015, those chum populations seemed to be quite resilient and they were doing really well. So it's only in the last year or two that we've started to see sort of a downturn in the chum, and that could be related to their age structure. So some of the ones that were returning in 2018, 2019 were ones that were spawning in those really bad years of 2015 and 2016. So it takes a bit of time for those generations to kind of move through and to have high productivity again. But related to the low Columbia River endangered population, it was low, but I don't think it was as dramatically reduced as we saw in the Fraser and Puget Sound. And the sneak peek of the forecasts are that there could be a little bit of a bump beginning in 2021 to those recent downturns we've seen in a couple of years.
Do we have any other questions from any of the viewers? Anyone? No, I don't see any other questions in the chat. Is there any other questions in the Q&A? Oh, we do have a question. Thank you. And Lyle asks, what actions can students take to help endangered salmon populations? That's an excellent question.
That is an excellent question. And I'm really glad that someone asked that, because students are really one of the, they're the future. And also there's a number across the state of Washington, there's a number of what we call them co-op projects. So these are high school students, these are, other work groups, and what they're really engaging in salmon conservation. And what they're doing is that they're rearing salmon, so chum salmon in egg boxes and across the state, and they're releasing these fish and they're sort of supplementing some of the natural populations. So students can definitely get engaged with some of that. And I'm not sure if the Estuarium is directly involved in some of that work. I know I have an educator friend down in the Columbia River who works extensively with students on this type of stuff. And I really encourage the youth, especially, those who are passionate about STEM and about the natural world, to get engaged there, be part of the solution. So thank you for that question. And, it's really always inspiring for me to see the students that are taking up and becoming engaged. And that reminds me, so there's also a really, I had mentioned at the beginning of the talk that one of the ecosystem services that salmon provide is that they provide marine nutrients to terrestrial ecosystems. So there's a great program on the Nisqually River where salmon carcasses are used as inputs into the Nisqually watershed to sort of enhance everything from, the insect community to the trees to, the whole terrestrial ecosystem. And it's kids that are really leading up that effort. So good stuff.
Oh, that's amazing. That's good to hear. That's amazing. Do we have any other questions from our viewers? Anything? Anybody?
And like I said, I'm happy to answer any comments or questions on the Facebook Live after if you think about something, or feel free to get in touch with me. So Marisa Litz, I'm at the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife. Happy to talk salmon anytime or ocean conditions.
Okay, thank you so much, Doctor. Let's see. Oh, we do have another question. Diane asks, there was a report this winter that an additive to tires and road runoff was directly causing coho mortality. Is this only affecting coho? That's a good question.
That is a great question. And I was wondering whether or not to put this into this talk. And it's really exciting work because it really, it was like an ecological whodunit. And the leaders of this work were at the University of Tacoma, as well as federal scientists at Manchester. And, for years, they had noticed that coho in largely urbanized streams were dying, pre-spawn mortality when they were returning to these systems. And ecotoxicology studies and other studies were inconclusive, and they didn't know exactly what was causing this. But what they found was that it really was the byproduct of tire tread. So it gets worn off and it begins to degrade, so oxidize and degrade in these urbanized systems. And one of the byproducts of this tire that wasn't a classified sort of organic compound was the culprit. I really commend the scientists who saw this out through sort of identifying this compound, because it really it took a lot of tenacity and perseverance to identify this particular chemical. As far as I know, coho are the most vulnerable, but I can't definitively say, but there would be no reason for me to expect that other species like Chinook and steelhead and pink and chum would be any less vulnerable. So sorry I don't have a definitive answer for you, but it's really quite shocking and telling that we need to do more to eliminate those types of chemicals in our watersheds, especially in highly developed urbanized systems that were once strongholds for salmon in Puget Sound. Oh, Nicole, you're muted.
Sorry about that. I was experiencing a little bit of technical difficulties. Let's see. We do have another question. Orlay asks, Kokanee are in big trouble in North Puget Sound and Sammamish River. This may not be in your area of expertise, but any insight into what effort WDFW is doing for these fish? Egg boxes?
So great question, Orly. So kokanee is actually the resident form of sockeye salmon and in North Puget Sound. So I imagine he's probably referring to freshwater systems where there are a lot of these, and there's also both anadromous sockeye as well as kokanee in systems like Baker Lake. So I'm not sure of any egg boxes that are being used. And the specific efforts that DFW or tribal or federal hatcheries are doing to sort of prop up kokanee populations, but certainly a great question for hatchery managers on that.
Okay. So let's see. So I'm going to go ahead and let you go. Thank you so much, Dr. Litz, for all of your expertise and knowledge. I myself learned so much from your talk. And so this presentation, Dr. Litz, your presentation will be available on our the Puget Sound Estuarium YouTube next week.
Awesome, great. Because I know a lot of folks that were interested and couldn't log in or had some conflicts. So happy to do that. Really honored to be invited by the Puget Sound Estuarium to celebrate Black History Month and to spotlight salmon and my work, and really been a privilege. So thank you all, and thanks to the audience for tuning in at this kind of awkward hour. Let's all go have some dinner time now, and much appreciated.
Oh, thanks for your time and speaking with us. I think I speak for everybody, including our viewers, that you are on top of your field, you're on top of your game, and we're excited whenever you can spend a little bit of time with us, enlightening us about, the dangers and hazards that, Puget Sound salmon in general face.
Right on.
You have a good night.
You have a great night too. Thank you very much.